This paper is Urban Tibetological, and it was jointly written by Anna Sehnalova and myself. So I'm going to read it. Our Tibetan territorial deity cosmology is part of a wider Pan-Asian tradition, or are they broadly shared across much of the Tibetan or are they specific to migrating the Tibetan plateau? There's been a lot of debate about this over recent years. But I think the growing body of ethnographic philological data indicates that all these perspectives contain being popular and one or the other doesn't help. There are aspects of the Tibetan territorial data tradition that respect the wider Pan-Asian traditions, others that run across much of the plateau, but also very much in wider Asia. There are also traditions that seem specific to particular local regions of Tibet. It's equally evident that over the last 14 centuries, all these elements have substantially intermingled with one another. Like a well-baked cake, you can't isolate the real ingredients very easily. A much easier task, I think, is to focus on the dynamics of cultural hybridity, how these different elements work together. So our topic today is a series of mantras in the mortuary text, anonymously compiled out of two works by the celebrated 17th century Tibetan master, Karma Chakme. It's called The Great Treasure of Virtue and Goodness, the practice of establishing ancestral bones. It's used by the monks of Daratang Monastery of Golok, East Tibet, where Dr. Anna came from, who was in California. Daratang is a branch of the great Paldal Monastery of Kham, which is the main upholder of the famous Karma Chakme traditions. So our talk is based on Anna's article of 2022, which analysed this ritual. Now, in Golok, this ritual is de facto reserved for the burials of elite clan members. It's very deeply embedded in the local territorial deity cosmology. And today we can't look at the ritual as a whole, but we're just going to focus on mantras. They illustrate how Karma Chakme and Tibetan Buddhism in general sought to situate local Tibetan territorial deity cosmology within a more universal Buddhist worldview. This funerary ritual should be seen as a special adaptation of the ubiquitous practice of burying treasure vases or kevabum as offerings to territorial deities. Treasure vases are containers filled with richly empowered auspicious substances, including medicines, grains, precious metals, valuable minerals, printed mantras, one rather central Chokshing or Yasni. Across much of Tibet, these are offered to territorial deities by burying in the earth or placing in lakes, and so on. One can find approximately similar rites to the Indian Nāgas and yakşas in Indian Buddhist states, such as the Vajrapani Tantra. But the Lamas also claim a white Mahakala Tantra and scriptural source. Nevertheless, the ritual is simultaneously, and for many people, primarily understood within the framework of local territorial deity prognosis, adhering to their logic and respecting their categories of belief. Its purpose is to increase the stock of fair, which in Sanskrit would be nidhi, treasures owned by the local territorial deities, so that through this enrichment, the deities themselves can foster more vital essence, or rasa, which will in turn increase the abundance and well-being of the local lived environment. It should also be noted that in Golok, the apical mountain deity is seen as the ancestor of the local clan, since he had offered his daughter in marriage to a leader of the human clan when they first migrated into the area some centuries ago. The vitality force of the apical ancestral deity is thus shared with the members of his extended kin and retinue, and repeatedly gives life to the local human community, and in particular, the leading members of the human clan. In a cyclical manner after death, the vitality force penetrates the ecological environment and ascends once again to the divine mountaintop court from which it previously descended. So too, clan leaders themselves can also be reborn in the sky palace of the modern deity, from where they might cyclically reincarnate back into the human clan. This is a fascinating parallel to the Tibetan Tulku system. I think was the reason the Tulku system took off. This was there before. Well, that's Anna's work, actually, not mine. Along with the grains, mantras, and other auspicious substances, The treasure vase in this case will also contain the post-crematory bones of the deceased clan leader. In this liturgy, bodily remains are themselves seen as a valuable form of ter or treasure because they contain the vitality force and the young force of fecundity and abundance, and hence can be offered to the ancestral territorial deities of the clan to enrich them and their land. While not necessarily in contradiction to Indian Buddhist practice, following Anna Sehnalova 2022, we also consider this might preserve cultural survivals from the non-Buddhist cumulus burial traditions of imperial times that were largely discontinued after the ascendancy of Buddhism. It might also count, we think, as evidence in support of Ronald Davidson's suggestion that the Tibetan Terma tradition could have been influenced by the ritual categories of cumulus burials. Indian Buddhist veneers had little to say about monastic quality funerals, except to imply that funerary arrangements were a pragmatic matter more for the benefit of the living than the dead, and should therefore take into consideration the human fear of ghosts and the expectation of the surrounding cultures, and so on. Archaeologists and Indologists generally believe that Indian Buddhist funerary arrangements from the very start overlapped with and included elements from non-Buddhist tradition, although also introducing a distinctively Buddhist feature of the cult of relics. Thus, archaeological and textual research describes three procedures for managing post-crematory remains Indian Buddhists use. Charnel houses, or grounds where post-crematory remains could be left. Urn burials containing post-crematory bones together with additional small valuables such as philosophical or precious stones. Sanjaka, or small mouldings within which post-crematory ash and ground-up bones were mixed with clay and moulded into iconographic shapes. Funerary urns and sanjaka were often deposited around stupas and perhaps elsewhere as well, we don't yet know. Versions of all three of these Buddhist post-crematory procedures are still used in Tibet. Earlier Tibetan funerary practices for elites have been characterized by three features that were suppressed by Buddhism: huge earthen tumuli, large and extravagant grave treasures, and blood sacrifices. In India, the funerary stupa sites around which funerary urns and sanjaka were deposited were frequently located on hilltops and were also often deliberately built on top of much older megalithic burial sites. Chopin believes that the overlap between stupas and earlier burial sites remains too consistent to be coincidental, and that the Sangha purposely sought out places with previous funerary associations. Shaw adds the Sangha chose these places so as to tap into a pre-existing sacred order and to promote themselves as guardians of the native dead. It's interesting that these features are close to those of Tibetan Chakham, places for depositing sanjaka and dutra funerary sites, both of which are frequently placed on hill slopes or close to a hilltop and on top of all the previous pre-Buddhist burial sites. But the really distinctive feature of Buddhist burial of significance present in India was not merely to dispose of their bodily remains, but to create valuable relics out of them. Citing John Strong, Julia Shaw writes as follows: according to Indian Buddhist tradition, relics are not just ashes, but transformative substances akin to jewels or gemstones. Before being deposited in a stupa, these substances are placed inside a reliquary, often together with other relics of use, such as fragments of cloth, coins, or precious stones. The reliquary itself is usually made of stone or ceramic, following forms that are already well known from contemporary pottery vessels. The Buddhist relic cult represents a novel departure from older Indian traditions in a number of ways. First, the practice of dividing and distributing relics between more than one monument, thus spreading their perceived influence over extended geographical space. And secondly, in the idea that relics represent somehow the essence or life force of the deceased person. The Shimkot reliquary from Afghanistan, for example, has an inscription describing its contents as relics of the Blessed Shakyamuni, which are endowed with life, prana. We find a broadly similar concept in the Tibetan chieftains' burial ritual we're looking at today, where the vitality force is contained in the relics. Brahmins, by contrast, disposed of post-crematory remains by pouring in a river, over time increasingly coming to favour the Ganga. But again, these practices are also consciously emulated in Tibet for religious elites rather than chieftains. where pure and sacred water sources are used as a receptacle, and in special cases, ashes were even sent to the Ganges in India. Again, highly reminiscent of Tibet, we also know that the hilltop locations chosen for situating these Indian Buddhist funerary structures were themselves the major sites of territorial deity worship, the annual Naga and Yakṣa festivals. The very word Chaitya or Chaitya, indicating a Buddhist stupa, originally referred to the shrine of a Yakṣa. Similar in East Tibet, high-altitude cairns, like Tse, for the Yibduks, the major territorial deities, can also be burial sites. We as yet have no certain idea if funerary urns and such interments around Indian Buddhist hilltop stupas might therefore also have been simultaneously envisaged as honouring ancestral Naga and Yakṣa shrines. As far as we know, the archaeology for this has not yet been done, but it does seem eminently possible. In the case of Karma Chakran's ritual as used in Golok, the complete embeddedness of the procedure in the local territorial cosmology is amply reflected in the idea that the vase with its bone relics is seen as carried for the specific ancestral territorial deities specific to the local clan. The vase with its body remains has to be buried in a clan-specific graveyard that is geometrically situated to simultaneously overlook both the Golok ancestral mountain deity peaks and the clan community's Buddhist monastery. The Golok ancestral deities are not addressed by their proper names in the ritual, which is written for general use, not specifically for Golok. However, several categories of Tibetan territorial deities are listed, such as Subdak, Lu, Yin, Yibdak, Nerdak, along with categories cosmologically and ritually connected with them, such as Yang and La, which are different forces of different kind of life forces in a way. We might here also include the Patsun and Matsun, or male and female ancestors, which in Golok are connected with their territorial deities. It's widely accepted that Indian Naga law was introduced to Tibet along with Buddhism, where it merged with indigenous beliefs about Lu, so that the word Lu is now accepted as a Tibetan translation of Naga. There have been some excellent historical studies of Lu, such as Lotan and Dolce in 2013, and more recently, Palden and Terry in 2021. Palden makes some extremely interesting points. She argues that prior to Buddhism, Tibetan Lu were not specifically water beings at all, nor were they serpentine, nor were they guardians of treasure. And to this day in Golok, at a vernacular level, Lu are not usually serpentine, and are not usually the primary guardians of treasure, although they do tend to be various kinds of water beings. At a Buddhist textual level, however, Lu are typically serpentine water beings and guardians of treasure, like the Indian counterparts. It's clear that territorial deities, like Nagas, were so integral to Indian Buddhism that such beliefs were unavoidably translated and propagated along with the Vinyas, Sutras, Tantras, and Shastras. Nowadays, Buddhist rituals dedicated to the local Lu inhabiting a Tibetan territory can routinely evoke famous Pan-Asian Naga individuals and categories, as though classifying the local Lu within the category of the Pan-Asian Nāgas. For example, Karma Chakra wrote a sung offering as a juniper smoke offering for lay people and monks to make offerings to their local Lu. Sung is a Tibetan fumigation offering in which fragrant juniper and or other substances are burned to create a purifying smoke linked to local deities. Yet in this liturgy, even when performed with the Lu of the local neighborhood in mind, a host of famous Indian or Pan-Asian Nāgas are named as recipients, along with associated Indic categories of Nāgas, Nanda, Upananda, Takshaka, Shankapala, the 8 great Naga kings, Nāgas of the 4 castes, and so on. What has not so far been much researched is the introduction of the parallel Indian concept of Yakṣa to Tibet, and how this was associated with Tibetan territorial deities of the land. From the Indian notion of Naga seems to have quite substantially overwritten the Tibetan idea of Lu. This might not have happened to quite such an extent with the Yakṣa. The category Yakṣa was clearly recognized as an Indian territorial deity, and it seems to have been most unambiguously applied within the specific context of wealth deities who retained their Indian identity. However, when approached in the aspect as treasure protectors, which was one of their key roles, within the territorial deity cosmology. The great ancestral model deities themselves could also be identified as or associated with yakshas. In this way, the famous Yüllha, like Anyamachen and Nyempuyutse, are considered to be the prime owners of all the Ter or Nidhi in Golok, and like yakshas, they are often depicted with treasures in their hands. Iconographically and liturgically, they can also be considered members of Jambalas ritually. The great mountain deity of Sikkim, Kanchenjunga, is similarly associated with Indian Yakṣa by Shravana. Yue Wong describes how the great central Tibetan mountain deity, Yinchen Tangla, can appear as a Yakṣa and as a treasure protector. Although she only mentions the religious sense of Nima, Buddhist term, textual term, rather than in the more vernacular sense of environmental wealth. Nevertheless, it's possible that Indian ideas about yakshas did not so comprehensively override indigenous narratives about their various potential Tibetan counterparts as happened with the Nāgas and Hui. Neither the great ancestral mountain deities of Tibet, nor numerous other landscape deities such as Yen and Sen, were primarily reimagined in the mold of Indian yakshas, except in the context of Ter. In this monastic mural, Nyempuyutse and the other great Yüllha still retain their Tibetan warrior appearance, even if now associated with Jambala. By contrast, modern monastic depictions of Lu are usually serpentine, although back in the 13th century, Guru Charan could still describe Lu as appearing in more varied forms, some of them non-aquatic. The topic is complex, highly nuanced, and remains understudied, so that whatever we are saying remains exploratory. The consistent Tibetan translational term of Yakṣa Inuchi, a very early example, is found in the so-called Edict of Samye, an imperial period inscription that is one of the very earliest extant Tibetan texts. It describes how various classes of deities were called upon to witness solemn oath taken by the Tibetan emperor, including not only the various Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, but also all the Kudla deities, the 9 kinds of gods, the Lu, Nurchin, which is Nāgas and yakshas, and non-humans of the land of Tibet. Note the pairing of Lu and Nurchin, which mirrors the Indian pairing of Nāgas and yakshas, and the inclusion among the indigenous territorial deity categories. Subsequent generations of Tibetan lamas continue to take a great interest in Indian yakshas, as one can easily discover by consulting, for example, the 9th volume of the Drupta Kuntu collection, which focuses on wealth deities and rituals, including treasure vases. Among them we find the knowledge entrustment of the 9 male and 9 female yakshas, together with the practice method of the treasure vase, known as the excellent vase of every wish. This describes rituals and gives mantras for 18 yakshas and yakshis, with names such as Jambala, Manibhadra, Purnabhadra, Dhanadaya, Vaishravana, Vatadara, and so on. Although originating in India, several of these became truly Pan-Asian figures, represented where Buddhism went, whether Theravada or Mahayana. Moreover, having origins in South Asian territorial deities, some of these figures can be equally well known in non-Buddhist Indian traditions. No one has yet made a formal study of exactly how complete the association of Indian yakshas with wealth, rituals, and treasure vases is across the whole of Tibetan literature, but it could be highly relevant. Wealth rituals and treasure vases are most famously associated with the Indian Yaksha Jambala, who in iconographic descriptions often holds a jewel-spitting mongoose in his left hand, while pressing down with his feet the twofold nidhis or ter of Shankar and Padma. Since treasure vases in particular are so integral to the territorial deity cosmology, this implies some kind of association of yakshas with their perceived Tibetan equivalents. Like the Lu or Naga rite mentioned above, there's a dual coding. At a textual level, treasure vases are dedicated to Jambala, even when monks and laity alike can actually understand the treasure vases to be offered to a local terdak. Likewise, yakshas are richly represented in Tibetan art, and as with the textual sources, usually in connection with wealth and treasure. Chakme's funerary treasure vase liturgy shows the contextual association of Indian yakshas perceived as wealth gods, with Tibetan territorial deities perceived as arbiters of wealth in the local environment. Both groups go by the epithet treasure lords, terdak, in Tibetan literary and vernacular traditions. So now I want to look at the mantras in common Chinese funerary treasure text bars. Not all of them are for yakshas, but enough are to be of interest. The first mantra, Om Chiti Raja Swaha for Chiti Dharma, the bodhisattva associated with the earth and also with filial and ancestral piety, very suitable for burying an ancestor. Paired with Om Prithvi Devi Swaha for Prithvi, the Indian goddess of the earth, here referred to by one of her Tibetan names, Tenma. Next comes a mantra from the noble Mahayana Sutra of the 8 appearances of the earth and sky, which is used in Tibet to pacify deities from all the various deities or spirits who inhabit the landscape. There are variants of this so-called heart mantra of the 8 appearances of the earth and sky. Komachak may raise it here as we have on the screen. But we have an old xylograph which has it differently. As far as we're aware, the sutra has not yet been studied, and we only managed to find one poor quality Tibetan text that is not always legible. It contains extensive lists of Indic deities deemed Laukika by Buddhism, such as Brahma, Indra, and Vishnu, alongside many Indian and possibly also Tibetan categories of Nāgas or Lu. Some famous named Indian Nāgas, such as Takshaka, as well as named Indian yakshas, including Manibhadra, Purnabhadra, Vichi Kundalini, Panchika Kubera, and Jambala. But it equally contains extensive lists of Chinese zodiacal characters, as well as numerous Tibetan territorial deities classified as Nyen, and it's quite unlikely to be an Indian text. Nevertheless, one can still see within it, among other things, a prominent display of the territorial deity categories of Buddhist India, transposed into Tibetan ritual to pacify the forces of the Tibetan landscape. At the end of the text, we find a list of the mantras that are to be written or printed on paper and put on the yashti or sokshing in the prison. First comes the Dharani of the famous Arya Paramita Ayutthana Nama Vajnana Sutra, very popular in Tibet, a canonical scripture connected with the Buddha Amitayus that's actually been popular since the 9th century. There are hundreds of copies of it at the moment. This has no relation to yakshas and pertains to longevity rather than wealth. But note that Nima longevity rites have co-opted Tibetan concepts such as La and Yan that are connected with Tibetan territorial deities. Next come 3 mantras connected with wealth, all of which invoke Indian yakshas. This is the mantra Jambala, the principal Tibetan wealth deity and a major deity for treasure vases, who's described as taking yaksha form and existing among the yakshas, even though he is sitting away from Buddha. So liturgically, again, Tibetan authors like Vipan include within his the element Yakṣa Senapataye, the great general of the yakshas. And a widely used verse of praise, Apenitu Mepam Sarna, praise him as lord of the many yakshas and steward of wealth. John was also counted as one of the 9 male yakshas in the text from the Drupta Kunti I mentioned above. Next is a mantra by Vaisravana. On Vaisravana Swaha. From the point of view of Tibetan iconography, Jeff Watt describes Vaisravana as leader of the Yakṣa race and a worldly guardian, worshipped as a wealth deity and protector. In his liturgy of praise for this deity, Chense Wangpo describes Vaisravana as great master of the Yakṣa's treasures, describes his retinue as the Yakshanic retinue of Yakshas, mentioning the Yakshas Jambala, Purnabhadra, Kubera, Samneya, Atalata, Panchika Vichi Kundalini, several human and Asian figures. Next we have Om Vasudharini Swaha, the mantra for the wealth goddess Vasudhara. Hugely popular in Nepal, she's also widely known in Tibet as Jambala's consort. In Chinese very short daily sadhana for her, Vasudhara, Jambala is described as a consort, and the invocation, Om Sri Sava Vasudhari Jambala Saparivara, etc., and the offerings Om Sri Vasudhari Jambala Saparivara, etc., are making the two of them as a couple with their entourage. Likewise, Jambala's mantra should be recited after hers. Vasudhara is also one of the 9 yakshas in the Drupta Kunti text we discussed above. But much of the text describing the consecration of the treasure vase or cherubim is focused on her. Next comes a mantra for Mahabala. Earlier in the text, the mantra of the deity Mahabala is recommended to be wound around the yakshi as a source of power. The first half of the mantra would therefore seem to signify the Mahabala, who is one of a set of 10 or so deities popular in Nima iconography that inhabit the 10 directions around the main deity. Within that group of 10, Mahabala typically inhabits the nadir. The term Ujjasva can also often imply a kind of deity who counteracts impurity. However, there's also a more obscure Yakṣa Mahabala, which I'm showing here, who is a wealth deity. Similarly, the mantra includes the final element, Ujjasva, which is used as a deity name in Nima, and sometimes signify the black form of Jambalaya as Yakṣa. About in detail which Mahabala is signified here, it might even be an amalgam. Of the famous medicine Buddha by Sadhguru. This is intended to pacify disease of the body, but we must recall that the Buddhist concept of healing is as much preventative as curative, so that the benefits of a Sadhguru practice include spiritual benefit in the awakening, and adequate supplies of wealth, food, clothing, and shelter and protection. For this reason, I think, prominently included in the Sadhguru Mandala are the 12 Yakṣa generals, originally Indian territorial deities whose worship was quite developed both in Tibet and in East Asia. So we see quite a strong connection between territorial deities, high landscape features, death or ancestry, prosperity and welfare treasures, including ancestral relics. These elements seem to have formed a whole, perhaps in Indian Buddhism as well as in Tibet. In our case study of Golok, they contribute to a local environmental cosmology, which might not be totally dissimilar to other regions of Tibet, and perhaps also to some degree to ancient India, since early Buddhism built on local tradition. Perhaps our findings might speak to cultural continuities which enabled Buddhism to settle so well in the Tibetan cultural environment. Our initial research question was how Indian yakshas were assimilated in Tibet. They certainly predominate in Tibetan rituals connected with wealth. But is a further and broader classificatory association between yakshas and Tibetan Yüllha at large also implied, perhaps in parallel to the association of Nāgas with Lu? Perhaps it's too early to draw too many conclusions, but we can certainly say that a similar dual coding is evident. Indian Nāgas and yakshas alike are often cited at a liturgical level, even when local territorial deities are intended at a vernacular level. Thanks.